Hello and welcome to episode number 2 of this series. In this episode, I want to talk about the most fundamental form of communication between components, and that is the parent-to-child communication using the input decorator. So again, we know that we can have multiple components in applications, and those components can, be like in a relationship. So they can, for example, have a parent-child relationship. So one component like hosting other components, right? So more often than not, we would like to pass some data from our parent component to our child components, and that is achieved using the input decorator. This is something that, for example, we can use to implement a master detail, let's say, relationship. So suppose, for example, there is a list of flights. You want to click one flight and then see the details of that selected flight below the list of available flights. So again, parent-child relationship, master detail relationship, if you will, and we can achieve that using the input decorator. Let's implement this. So the goal of this episode is to learn how to pass data from the parent component. The parent component in this case is going to be the component we developed in the previous episode, flight list component, to our child component. The child component is going to be the flight detail component that we're going to work on in this episode, and we're going to use the input decorator. So we'll implement a scenario where a flight agent selects a flight from the list of available flights, and the details of that flight are shown in the child component. The child component, as I said in this case, is going to be our flight detail component. So let's go ahead and update the flight detail component. And the update that I want to make on our flight detail component is to add this. So don't think about the input decorator for now. Just take a look at this part. So basically, we are creating the selected flight, right, of type flight. It could also be null, right? So we've got like a property in the flight detail component that could be either null or, it could also, contain the information of a flight, the flight model class that we created in episode number 1. And then it is marked with this, let's say, decorator, right? Add sign input. Let's talk about this a little bit. So this add sign input, it tells Angular that this property will receive its data from the parent component. So selected flight is a property that will hold the flight that was selected in the parent component. So the parent component of this current component, this is our child component, is going to be responsible for assigning some data, assigning a flight basically to this selected flight property. And we will see how the parent component is going to do that. So we are using, this exclamation mark. This is the non-null assertion operator. And we are using a pipe and the null keyword. Let's talk about these. So I'm talking about these two, this one and these two, this one, right? So the exclamation point or mark is a non-null assertion operator. It's part of TypeScript. So it tells TypeScript, don't worry, this will be assigned before it's used. Don't worry about the fact that the selected flight is not initialized yet. So the property can also be null. So when there is no flight kind of passed from our parent component to the child component, this property can be null. So this makes the component safe to use even when the selected flight is not yet initialized. So remember, the selected flight is going to get its value from the parent component, which is that flight list component we created in the previous episode. But it could also be null, right? So we need to accommodate for that. And we're using non-null assertion operator to prevent TypeScript from complaining. If we don't do that, TypeScript is going to complain that this property doesn't have a value, hasn't been initialized. We're going to, use this non-null assertion operator to kind of tell TypeScript, don't worry about this. It's going to get its value before I want to use it. So let me go ahead now. By the way, I have created a new branch, as you can see, and I have used ngserve to run the application. Now I'm going to go to flight detail component, and I am going to add this input. And then, of course, I need to add my imports. Input is going to come from Angular core. And then what I want to do, basically, flight is the type of this selected flight, right? So I have this property. I have this property inside of my TypeScript file. So that means that from my template file, I will be able to access this flight detail. I'm going to be able to access this selected flight property and kind of print out its different its different properties. Its different properties like the departure time and so on. So let me go ahead and write the code for the template. And I am going to talk about these. But before I do that, let me import command module. Whenever you're using these, for example, pipes, or when you are using directives, like for example, ngIf, you'd have to use the command module, import the command module. So let's talk about the template. It is not that difficult if you have some experience developing Angular applications. So as you can see, we are checking whether the selected flight has a value, and if it has some value, we are going to render this portion of our template, and we are going to print out the different values inside of the properties of that selected flight. If it doesn't have a value, we're going to render this ng template. The idea of this is no flight, right? So let's talk about this ng template. Ng template is a directive. So Angular has some directives. This is a structural directive. So it is used to define a template fragment that are not rendered by default, but you can control their rendering using some conditions. So they can be conditionally displayed or referenced later in the template. So I have created this ng template. It's not going to be rendered by default, but I can access it and I can render it conditionally. So when selected flight is null, this portion of my template is going to get rendered. So it's a placeholder for some HTML that you can show when you want to. And you can, of course, combine it with other directives, like, for example, ngIf, ngTemplate outlet, ngSwitch, and so on. These are not, again, the primary focus of this playlist, but this is something that I wanted to discuss. So ngTemplate, remember, it's a structural directive. And ngFlight, I'm sorry, the noFlight, this is the ID. So, noFlight is the template reference variable. It gives the ng template a name, a unique name, so you can refer to it inside of your component. For example, in that, if directive. In your component, you can use this, template reference variable to access that, or to reference that ng template. So think of it as define a named block of HTML that I might want to render later based on some condition. The next thing that we want to do now inside of the component we developed in the previous episode, flight list component, is that we want to kind of, select a flight in the list. Let me show you what I mean. So we've got different flights, as you can see here, right? So what I want to do is to be able to click these flights, right? And then I want to select them. So if I take you to, let me go to the flight list component. So flight list. If you take a look here, we have different li elements, right? And basically what I want to do is to be able to click these li elements, and I want to select them. So let me tell you how we can do that. First, we are going to update the TypeScript file of our component, flight list. We want to add this property, selected flight, and we are going to add this method. The method is going to receive a flight, and it's going to set the selected flight property using the flight that it has received in the parameter of the selected flight method. So let me go ahead to flight list TypeScript file. This is what we developed in the previous episode. So I can go ahead and create this property and the method. So the method is going to receive a flight, and it's going to set the property selected flight using that flight that it has, received. And now we want to update the li elements inside of the template by handling their click event. So whenever that li is clicked, we are going to invoke that select flight method, and we are going to pass the current flight to that method. So let me go ahead to the HTML file right here, and we are going, as I said, to handle the click event. So now whenever an li element is selected, the property using the select flight method is going to be set from the TypeScript file. So click select flight. This binds the click event to a method called select flight in our TypeScript file. So when the user clicks a flight from the list, from those li elements, this method is going to be called, and the current flight is going to be passed as input parameter, passing the click flight object as an argument. Also, we are going to render the flight detail component now. Remember, the flight detail component is going to receive an input parameter, right, from its parent component. The parent component in this case is going to be flight list. So we are going to render the flight detail component in the template of our flight list, because flight detail will be the child of flight list. So we are going to render flight detail, and the flight detail receives an input parameter. We are going to set that input parameter using binding. The name of that input parameter was selected flight, and the property we want to pass to that input parameter is the selected flight local property for our parent component, which is the flight list. So let me go to the flight list, and I can, for example, create an H2 or H3 here, and say flight details, for example. The details of the selected flight is going to be rendered below this. And as I said, I am going to render the flight detail, pass the input parameter, input property. The name is selected flight, and the name of this local property again is selected flight. The names do not need to match, right? You can choose whatever you want. And of course, inside of the flight list component, I need to import my flight detail component if I want to use it in the template. It says, please select a flight to view details. If you remember, in the flight detail component, we had this ng template. So this is the ng template that is getting rendered. Why is it getting rendered again? Because the selected flight is null right now. It doesn't have a value. So this line displays the flight detail component. We are setting the input, property to selected flight. This is the property binding of Angular. It passes the value of the parent selected flight property into the child components, selected flight input property. Again, remember, the names do not need to match. You can choose whatever name you want because you're doing binding. In this case, the name of the property in our parent component is the same as the input property in our child component. So the child component receives the selected flight when you click on that li element. And remember, when you click that li element, that selected flight property of our parent component is going to be set, right? And when this gets a value, the binding is going to pass the value of this selected flight to that input parameter or input property of our child component. So if I click each one of these, I can get the details. So this portion of my template is displayed now. I can go ahead and inside of my flight list template, I can get rid of this. I don't want two flight details. That's it. So test the communication, run the application. You will see a list of flights. Click on a flight and you will see the detail of that flight. And that was it. So in this episode, we talked about input. Input is used when you want to send some data from your parent component to your child component. So parent to child communication. We pass the selected flight from our parent component. In the parent component, selected flight is a normal property. But in the child component, the name is selected flight, but it is an input property. And then we're going to use property binding. We're going to invoke the child component and use property binding syntax, which is this. This refers to the input property of our child component. This refers to the local property in our parent component. So we handle selection in the parent to control the data sent to the child, and this demonstrates a clean parent-child data flow. And that was it for this episode. If you enjoyed watching this episode, again, as always, try to support the channel by giving the videos a like, share them with someone, leave a comment, and I will see you in the next episode.